Welcome back to Organized, the Business Law Breakdown. I'm Seth C. Orenberg, and we're talking about mastering LLCs. And in this episode 9, we're peering into some advanced frontiers of LLC law. There are states that are adopting some really innovative forms that didn't exist even a few years ago, and it's really on the cutting edge of business associations. We'll talk about series LLCs, DAO LLCs, and professional LLCs. These specialized forms spotlight just how adaptive the LLC structure can be. We'll see how series LLCs isolate liability across separate cells, how DAO LLCs integrate blockchain governance, and how PLLCs tackle professional licensing and malpractice concerns. So, we're going to take a brief spin into a major world. So I don't want to pretend that we're going to cover all of this to the point where you can go out there and actually practice this stuff. Each one of these topics would be at least a season onto itself. My goal here is for you to get exposed to the possibilities that exist. And that can help you plan, because if you discover that one of these options really works for your business needs, you can explore further or hire an attorney who is experienced with this type of entity. So with that, first up are series LLCs, a concept popularized in Delaware and a handful of states. Not every state with an LLC law has a series LLC concept. But when they do, a series LLC allows you to create a master LLC that establishes multiple series. Each series is almost like a subsidiary, but you don't have to file additional formalities. Each series has its own assets, liabilities, members, and governance structure. They're all like micro LLCs. But again, you don't have to file for each one. You can create them and disappear them much more easily. And again, this means we have to go through extra formalities, because now we're talking about separate balance sheets for each one, separate governance. But the idea is internal limited liability. Debts from one series can't reach the assets in another. So it's akin to having multiple subsidiaries under a corporate parent, but it's done with a single LLC, which means you only need to file once. You don't have to tell the world every time you start a new project, and you can shield liability. Who would use this sort of thing? Well, if you're buying multiple houses and you're renting them out, you might want to silo those into separate series. You could always have done this by having a corporation and a subsidiary for each home that you own, but that gets expensive. You have to have formalities for each one. You have filing fees for each one. Suddenly you have 8 houses. You have a calendar where you have 9, because we have the master, 9 different filings that we have to make each year. And it just gets onerous. This is a much simpler way to handle this type of siloed ownership. But again, it's only based on state law, so we have to see if the state has enabling provisions that allow it. Delaware does. Delaware LLC Act Section 18215, and perhaps your local version of the Uniform Limited Liability Company Act series amendments might give you access to having a series LLC. You might remember that you can file in whatever state you want. You don't have to live in Delaware to have a Delaware LLC, but you do have to have a registered agent in that location. And what does it get you? It gets you isolation of risk. So again, consider the real estate concept. If you have investors who form a series LLC, you can put each property in a separate series. So if property A faces a lawsuit, property B's assets remain protected. It's as if they were separate LLCs. This saves on formation costs, on administration time. It's simply simpler. The big caveat is whether courts or bankruptcy trustees in states that don't recognize the series will respect these liability partitions. Remember, this is not universal. And so let's say you form a Delaware LLC and you create series, and you go and you do business in a state that doesn't have a series LLC. If you commit torts, like if someone gets injured on a property, is the state going to respect the quote-unquote limited liability shield? Well, I think it depends. This is not a well-established area of law. So the biggest risk in this cutting-edge field is uncertainty. If you want certainty, just make a Delaware corporation. We pretty much figured out how they work. However, if you go with one of these newer forms, you do run risks that you'll be the test case and you don't know how that's going to land. Now, some people are willing to take that risk. Others, it's not worth it. But that's the major issue or drawback, is that we just have fundamental unresolvable legal uncertainty around how states that don't have series LLC laws will treat series LLCs in bankruptcy or potentially in some other kind of context, like a tort case. Next, let's look at DAO LLCs. DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And this is a broad name for a type of blockchain-based smart contract distributed decision-making organization. I could spend a week on this topic, so I'll try to do it in 30 seconds or less. The idea is that in most companies, you have human beings who vote. And in a partnership, it's one person, one vote. And in a corporation, it's one share, one vote. Well, in a DAO, it's one token, one vote. And the votes don't happen in a meeting usually. Usually they are regulated by an algorithm, a computer program called a smart contract, based on a ledger, a technology called a blockchain. And so instead of having a manager who sits in an office, token holders generally vote electronically. And if a proposal passes, a smart contract will automatically execute on its decision-making. Wyoming broke new ground by enacting legislation for DAO LLCs, and there are over 1,000 of them registered by now. I think that number is growing rapidly, although you don't actually need to file as a corporation to run a DAO. There are a lot of what we call unwrapped DAOs that just operate with computer code and no law. But there are states like Wyoming and now Utah and Tennessee where you can have an LLC framework or an LLC-like framework, and that means that you have this token-based governance organization where there's also legal person status. So the governments will recognize that this voting mechanic can actually own real property or enter into enforceable contracts in the real world. And we call this off-chain. So we have a combination of on-chain governance and off-chain governance. Members are represented by tokens, each conferring voting rights on proposals. And again, I'm really glossing over a lot of the ways this could be super customized, because as flexible as LLCs are, imagine turning this into the world of digital blockchain technology. But in any event, the general idea is we have an operating agreement which defines how proposals are introduced, and the operating agreement can be algorithmic. It's really a smart contract agreement. It's not a written document that has to be processed by natural language, but an actual literal computer program that will deal with votes in very particularized ways. Wyoming requires a statement in the Articles of Organization specifying it's a DAO LLC. Utah has a separate category for DAO LLCs, and now even has something called a DUNA, which is a decentralized not-for-profit association. In terms of fiduciary duties, again, we're in a very new space, so it's not always clear how this is going to work out. Members often attempt to disclaim or modify duties, and as we know, we have some ability to disclaim liabilities for fiduciary duties in an LLC context. There's really no case law to say how this is going to come out. Remember, the manifestly unreasonable disclaimers remain invalid if they undermine the core of the act that enabled the organization. So what would be a manifestly unreasonable disclaimer of fiduciary duties in the concept of a decentralized autonomous organization? We don't have an answer to that yet. So if you thought series LLCs brought legal uncertainty, well, this is even bigger. We have a ton of risk and uncertainty here. For example, what if the smart contract has bugs? Or what if it's not built in a way that prevents attack, and it's basically captured in the ways that blockchains can be captured? Or what if a rogue proposal passes? Or what if the proposal is illegal? Who's accountable? Traditional LLC law says members or managers can't disclaim intentional misconduct, and this tension is untested in many jurisdictions. It starts to get really weird. So I'm looking forward to following this space very closely, and I hope you are too, because I do believe there are uses for these type of organizations. But this is not the sort of thing you do just willy-nilly. Now you need to have a sophisticated knowledge of corporate law, of contract law, and of the technology that would power these things. In a corporation, you can't have non-human board members. One of my colleagues, Todd Henderson, wrote a paper called Boards Are Us, where he suggested that boards could be run by corporations. But in every state in America today, boards have to be natural human beings who make decisions. And obviously this is very different, where a DAO, the highest level of decision-making, is going to be done by computer code. It's an attempt to replicate and replace hierarchical management with direct token-based participation. It's an entirely different approach. It's avant-garde, it's uncertain, and it's subject to all sorts of scrutiny. But it sure is interesting, and it's actually real. There are thousands in the world today. A third specialized area is professional LLCs. If you're a lawyer, doctor, accountant, or other licensed professional, your state might not permit you to hide your malpractice liability behind an LLC. Remember, an LLC is going to give you limited liability for debts and torts. But if you commit a tort while functioning as a doctor, the medical board might require that you are obligated to this personally. So typically, all owners of a professional limited liability company must hold the same relevant professional license, and it is designed not to protect you from malpractice liability. So basically, PLLCs are built with a deliberate hole in the veil, right where malpractice liability sits, allowing malpractice liability to attach to the members of the LLC. And this is deliberate because you can't have that shield and function as a lawyer or doctor or an accountant or other licensed professional in many states. And so this ability to allow malpractice liability is a feature and not a bug, because then you can actually hide your other liabilities. And maybe hide is the wrong term. Shield might be more appropriate, because hide indicates some kind of fraud or misdoing, and then we could still have piercing. But if you form a professional limited liability company as a lawyer, well, now you're in a situation where your ordinary business contracts are not going to create personal liability for you, just the malpractice that you have to be responsible for. And in general, by the way, those things can be insured against. This is different from how law firms have traditionally formed as partnerships, and this gives law firms a new type of professional flexibility where they can be managed differently. So you can imagine that the rigid structure of a partnership doesn't work for every law firm model. And just to throw it in there, there's also a concept called a professional corporation, which has a similar kind of idea where we can have corporate formalities and we merge professional ethics with corporate governance. Now, these areas are less problematic. They're just sort of an interesting variety that only is useful in cases where you must have professional ethics responsibilities, but they're an option in many states where it's important for professionals to maintain liability. So, what's our takeaway? Series LLCs are great for partitioning assets, but cross-state recognition is patchy. And some lenders or investors might find it confusing. So if you're engaging in real estate transactions, if your state has a series LLC law and you live in that state, that might be a better choice than if you don't live in a state or aren't going to own those properties in an area that has the same series LLC law, because it just might be disregarded and banks might not know what to do with it. Decentralized autonomous organization LLCs are a potential revolution. They change governance completely. They are highly experimental. They face untested legal scenarios, and token-based votes and liability for directors and managers is like a new concept that we're just starting to work out. PLLCs are perfect for licensed professionals who want limited liability for general business debts, while ethics codes require professionals to remain responsible for malpractice. And so we see that LLC law is continuously evolving. A decade ago, no one would have predicted states legislating for a Dow LLC. Similarly, series LLC's concept started in Delaware and are proliferating nationally. As technology or corporate models shift, the LLC's contractual DNA can adapt faster than most corporate codes, although legal certainty often lags behind innovation because the nature of our common law is we don't really know what the law is until we have enough lawsuits. And you don't necessarily want to be that guy. So that's our glimpse at advanced frontiers in the LLC universe. Series LLC for asset partitioning, Dow LLC for blockchain governance, PLLCs for licensed professionals, and each variant showing how the LLC's flexible framework can accommodate unique goals, whether that's isolating liabilities, decentralizing governance, or meeting professional licensing rules. Caution is warranted. especially when crossing state lines or dealing with novel structures untested in courts. We're going to wrap this up in episode 10, our final episode of this season. We'll compare LLCs directly to corporations and partnerships. We'll provide a cohesive overview, and we'll help you decide what form best fits you or your client's business objectives. And until then, as always, I'm Professor Seth C. Orenberg, and this has been Organized, the Business Law Breakdown.